All right, we're good. We will share the recording with everyone who has registered for the event, and this and all of our lessons learned series are available on both our website and our YouTube channel. So it is my pleasure to introduce the authors of our article today, Humanizing STEM Education, an exploratory study of faculty approaches to course redesign. And we are joined today by Mehri Azizi, who is a student at the Department of Biological Studies at Florida State University, or Florida International University, my apologies. Josh Caulkins, director of the Center for Teaching and Learning Excellence at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and a graduate, I am not reading well today, and a Gardner Institute Teaching and Learning Fellow. Welcome, Josh. Mehri Ahmed is an associate professor of biology at a Connecticut college and also a Gardner Institute Teaching and Learning Fellow. Stephanie Foote is the associate vice president for teaching, learning, and evidence-based practices at the Gardner Institute and also teaches at Stony Brook University. And Wuetherick is an associate provost of academic programs, teaching and learning at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan. So welcome, everyone. We have a wonderful, amazing panel. I'm going to pass this over to our host, Dr. Drew Koch, who is the CEO at the Gardner Institute. Welcome, everyone.
Katie, thank you. And Mehri, Maze, Steph, Josh, Brett, it's great to be with you all. Thanks for agreeing to do this. So I want to make available and both clear to our participants today, coming close to what 45, 50 participants already, that there is a link to the article, Humanizing STEM Education, Exploratory Study of Faculty Approaches to Course Redesign, available with this recording. And if we haven't already done so, my colleagues, Brittany and or Katie, are going to go ahead and put it in the chat. But we're excited. This makes 2 out of 3 of the author series that we've done so far, where the materials are available free of charge, fully online. So it's a cool thing for both access and for dissemination. I'm really, really pleased to be able to talk with the 5 of you today. And I could just dig right in, right? But and I'm going to start with a question which may be simple, but it's quite telling, quite important. How did the 5 of you come together to co-author this article? What brought 5 cool kids like you together to do this cool article? Don't all jump at once.
I think Stephanie, you should start.
Well, just to kick it off, I am the least cool of the group, so we'll just put that out there. We can all acknowledge that. I, though, have been very fortunate over the last several years to get to work with this very esteemed group on our Teaching and Learning Academy. And a lot of the work that's documented in the article is a representation of what we've been doing over the last few years, especially since COVID, the pandemic, to translate what was once an in-person day and a half experience that was limited to about 175 to 200 people to something that's more, I think, meaningful and sustained, a community of practice, really centered on liberatory practices, which we'll talk more about in just a few minutes. So we came together to tell the story, to really share some of the highlights of these participant narratives to help people to understand what it is that faculty are doing and how they're doing it in their courses to really address equity challenges that exist. And we were so fortunate to have the help and guidance and leadership of Mehri. She's a doctoral student, as Katie said, and she's studying under Dr. Brian Dewsbury, one of our other Teaching and Learning Academy fellows. And she led us in the development of this article. So we're so grateful to Mehri and also to all of you for this opportunity. Colleagues, what else would you like to share?
I'm happy to just jump in briefly and say that I've been involved in the TLA program, the Teaching Learning Academy, for pretty much since its inception, and I've watched it evolve over many years under the leadership of Drew and Steph and others. And I just wanted to say that being able to participate with Mehri and Mace and Brad has really, in my opinion, one of the greatest opportunities in terms of just thinking about how do we make our courses more engaging, more equitable, more inclusive. And it's, by the way, that's like some of the hardest work I've had to think about when I think about my own teaching or supporting other teachers. And I know that we have all grappled with that in our own ways. And so how do we then design these experiences initially in person, and then after COVID, really pretty much online, so that way we can really think critically about what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we engage with our students, how we support our students, how do we think critically about what we're doing as teachers. And so this is where I know Brad and Mason, Mary, and Steph, when we started to think about, can we showcase some of this? Can we show this in an article? That's really where it came from, was some of that shared history.
You know, Josh, I heard you talk about sort of the evolution of this work. And I heard Steph earlier mention the phrase liberatory design and liberatory pedagogy. And sure enough, reading through the article, it's all over the article, right? Both phrases, liberatory pedagogy, liberatory design, and even moving from backwards to liberatory design. So for purposes of clarity for our audience today, and maybe even just for me, what is liberatory design, and why did you choose to use it in this work? And I'll aim that one to Steph, unless she wants to shift it to someone else.
Oh, I have to turn to my good colleague, Brad Wuetherick, to talk about that, to get us started at least.
Yeah.
Brad, would you do us a favor and do that?
So I think, thanks, Steph and Drew. I think that all of us as a team have been influenced in thinking about the work that we do around teaching and learning from a liberatory perspective throughout our careers. Well, we've all been inspired by the work of Freire, the work of Bell Hooks, the work of many others who have actually written about liberatory approaches to education. When I joined the TLA team a few years ago now, one of the things that I suggested that we might do is actually look to a framework for liberatory design that came out of the National Equity Project, which was an initiative based out of California, really aimed at K-12 system transformation in education, but really had was very applicable to the higher education context as well. So what that approach is trying to do is actually bring together thinking around liberatory practices and equity, together with design thinking, together with kind of the idea of understanding the complexity of equity challenges that we're actually facing. And through that, encouraging a process of reflection from understanding the challenges, truly interrogating the current state of affairs, and then engaging in liberatory practices and partnerships with communities to design solutions to those challenges. And so within that context, we've actually turned this to the liberatory course design kind of approach, and actually using some of the work related to kind of course design that's come out of the literature and teaching, learning, and higher ed for many years around backward design, and trying to take it a little bit further to say, if we're designing for more equitable outcomes, actually engaging in a different kind of design through a liberatory approach is actually a really effective way to tackle it. And I think there's much more about that framework in the article, but I think that actually kind of it's kind of where that particular element came from. Although I think I will say, even without this model, this would all be we would be very much inclined towards these practices, and have been as individuals and colleagues right from our early days in our own practices at our own institutions. And I'd certainly invite others to comment beyond that as well, because I think certainly we were continuing to evolve our thinking around this model and taking it further, and some of that really comes from the work of Mace and the work of Brian and the work of others, to really push us to think differently about how we actually move forward in kind of the work that we're doing to address equity.
So I'm very eager to ask you all, what did you learn, particularly about working with faculty? I'm so eager that I'm going to ask you that next. But before I do, I'm going to ask you something else. I'm actually going to ask Mehri to respond to this one. Obviously, before the colon title of the article is Humanizing STEM Education. But I know from interacting with you, not just in advance of this, but from interacting with the team from the Teaching and Learning Academy, that there's greater application to this other than, quote unquote, just the STEM disciplines. And that's taking nothing away from the STEM disciplines. So, right. So, Mehri, how can this be applied to other disciplines, right? What's the application in STEM and beyond?
Thank you for the question. Actually, I love this question because nowadays we focus on STEM, and I love it because of the drop rate and all the recent statistics about the drop rates, especially in the first year of college. But going through the results, I was noticing that apart from STEM educators, those themes that came up, like communication, like student engagement, and how they instructors want to assess their success through grades, student feedback, those are very common between STEM and non-STEM educators as well. Actually, one of the themes that was specifically for STEM educators, and I noticed it was very prominent within the data, was the prior knowledge. So the prior knowledge in a STEM apparently plays more important, while the other themes that came up out of the data were, true about all STEM and non-STEM educators. So I would like to say for through humanizing, the courses, educators face some challenges like communication with the students, how to communicate more, how to engage them more, and how at the same time pace themselves while covering the subject matters. So these are pretty much common between STEM and non-STEM educators. And as I said, prior knowledge was the most prominent one within STEM educators.
Mehri, picking up on that within STEM educators and the prior knowledge piece, could you explain a bit more what you find authors meant by that and how it privileges some students or maybe some instructors and not others?
Well, actually, I'm gonna put my comment, and I invite others to add to it as well. But it may, stem from some inequities and that are within students before they enter college, and there are some skill gaps that students from high school, in transition from high school to first year of college, experience, that sometimes the system is not going to respond to that properly and fill the gap. So it's on educators' side, unfortunately, to try to even out those prior knowledge, which is different in within different students, and it's really challenging for STEM educators because STEM fields need more time and energy demanding and time demanding, and this prior knowledge, lack of prior knowledge, comes on top of all these, and that makes it difficult for educators to humanize their course. But like I said, the inequity before the college can be the first reason, plus social inequity and financial problems that come along with that can help to create this problem. But I invite others to add if they have any comments.
Yeah, thank you, Mehri. And thank you, Drew, for that question. So, I mean, historically, and this is not just what we're talking about, other scholars such as the wonderful Laura Randone, who in 2005 wrote about agreements in higher education. And those agreements, or you could think of them as assumptions that govern the culture of higher education, they allow some to succeed, but not others. And one of those agreements is that we focus so much on intellectual and cognitive knowing, and we don't look at other ways of knowing. And a lot of the students that come to our institutions, to our classes, and especially in light of the pandemic and the disruption, they may come lacking the textbook knowledge, but they have all these other skills of problem solving, of creativity that we don't pay attention to. We don't know how to assess. We don't know how to. And what ends up happening is we don't see their full humanity because we're seeing through a very narrow lens. And so that's another way. And I would argue that it's not just, we're not placing blame on faculty. It's a system. It's the institution. It's the culture of higher education. In this case, we're looking at STEM education.
Maze, I think it's super important. I know all of you feel this way because I know you, right? That you're not blaming faculty, you're actually naming them as agents for equitable teaching and learning. As a matter of fact, I'd argue, I know some of you would argue, probably all of you would argue, maybe the best agents for equitable teaching and learning, as long as there's good structure and support from the institutions, from departments, from units, with which the faculty are affiliated. So on that note, what did you learn about faculty development by doing this research and writing this article, right? 1, 2, 3, 40, well, maybe not that many, but some key things that showed up in the article that you want the audience to hear. Any one of you can start.
I'm happy to begin and then turn it over
Please.
to my colleagues. I think one of the things that stands out to me, and Mehri spoke to this earlier, and that's the challenges that faculty expressed in communicating with their students. And oftentimes these were students who they identified as first-generation students and other students from historically marginalized, resilient populations. And so I think about the significance of that, and it's not a STEM problem. Obviously, this is a challenge that all faculty are facing. And I also think, too, from my own perspective, as somebody who feels like I take a very humanized approach in my teaching, it can be difficult. Communication can be difficult. And we have to find ways to overcome some of those challenges. And I know, just talking to faculty on a daily basis, that faculty feel very upset, sort of disenchanted with the disengagement with students not reading emails. And, it's an ongoing problem. We have challenges communicating in the classroom and outside of the classroom. But, when I think about faculty development, and what I've learned here is that we have to spend more time determining how we're going to communicate to students and how we're going to bring them along on this journey, how this journey will be about them, how we'll celebrate their strengths, how we're going to come together as a community, and communication is really foundational to that. So that's something that really sticks in my mind moving forward.
Honor, this relates directly to what you learned about faculty development, and a question for you, maybe something that sort of surprised me in reading this, right, were the success measures and how grades actually popped up in success measures, because I know from working with many of my faculty colleagues, it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? They're a proxy for learning, but they're not the best proxy for learning, and they may not measure learning at all. So a question on that faculty development thing, right? What were the role of grades and other forms of measures in this, right? Because that clearly is a key learning in the work.
So I'll jump in with just an initial thought, and invite my colleagues to add. But I must admit, this is actually one of the things that I liked your double-edged sword kind of analogy there, because it's clear that in the goals that faculty articulated and in the ways that they thought they were having success, grades was clearly a piece of it. And as we know, from the literature, certainly grades will contribute to retention and the students, being able to continue through their studies. But grades actually, I'll just throw my own bias in there. I was a little disappointed that grades was the most common way that faculty thought of success. Because I think certainly a sense of community and belonging in within our institutions, that engagement of students to feel like they're meaningfully part of and partners within the learning process, is actually that to me would be the more meaningful success measure. But I think the reality is that faculty are working in an environment where their leaders are looking at grades as a way of seeing, did you actually achieve success in the work you're doing? Your grades didn't go up, so therefore, maybe it didn't have success. And I think that's actually a reality that many faculty are working within, and I think that our data kind of speaks to that faculty there's pressure on them to actually really focus on grades as that measure. So I think we still have work to do to kind of help people move beyond grades as that measure of success. But hold on.
Josh, did I cut you? I'm sorry, please.
Okay. So I would like to add that so some of the instructors were talking about how meaningful the conversations are in the class, and that's their way to assess their success in humanizing. Or they would say how much engagement in conversations are happening. Those were also there, but fortunately or unfortunately, as Brad put it, grade was the most prominent recursive type of assessment that educators chose to apply.
Other learnings about particularly working with faculty on their development around liberatory pedagogy, teaching and learning.
If I may, I want to add a little bit about this whole assessing of learning and the grading. I think there are a lot of conversations happening in STEM at the national level about what constitutes learning and what is meaningful learning. And I think, it takes time to move from the traditional way of assessing to doing assessing for learning or competency-based learning, grading or ungrading. And I think a lot of faculty members, myself included, it took me years to kind of change the way I assess. And even though I was convinced 10 years ago that I needed to change the way I assess, the reason it took me years, I needed to learn and also find the time to restructure my courses. And also, I may change the way I am assessing, I am grading, but the next class my students are going to go to and the next institution they're going to transfer to may not have caught up to what's, and so, so the hesitation, it's complex and it's multi-layered. Now, as Mehri said, and I'm sure my colleagues can attest, the conversations are happening, right? In other words, faculty may still be using the traditional way of, the grading, the numbers, but they're slowly but surely moving away towards something that is more centered around the student's experience and learning, and more around the laboratory design that Brad talked about earlier.
And to build off that, Mace, thank you so much, because I think one of the pieces that we neglect is that we have to expose ourselves and others to these new ways of assessment, to ways that the model of grades as equating to learning is a myth that we've grappled with for years and years and years, and that we can and should question the assumptions we make about how we assess learning in our classes. Yes, this is relevant to STEM, but it's relevant beyond in any discipline in higher education, that how we evaluate learning is fundamentally matters. And to do it critically means that we actually have to engage in dialogue with our peers and with experts, and by hey, we got to do our homework. If you're still teaching the same way you did 20 years ago, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I just want to say that we should really, we have an obligation to ourselves, our institutions, and our students, most importantly, to grapple with the new frameworks of how do we assess learning? What do we want to see in our courses? And do those courses align over time, over a given curriculum? And to me, those are questions that as a teacher and as teachers, we have to ask ourselves and each other those questions frequently. And that's why I think this article it's a very small piece of moving the needle of how and why we do this work. But when it comes to educational development, faculty development, it's about the visibility of these frameworks. Absolutely the laboratory design framework was one that we used, but also there's this whole thing around ungrading or alternative grading that we try to bring into these discussions. I'm just going to mention one more thing, which I think Mace has really brought into a lot of our conversations, which is the idea that we and our students have experienced trauma and do experience trauma, and that we actually have to think actively about how we do what we do because of this, not just COVID, but ongoing issues in our world. We really have to be aware of our own trauma. I think there was an article this morning by Kavanaugh in the Chronicle around our faculty have to feel good and feel like they're taking care of themselves and those around them. And that if we're not doing that, it's unsustainable. And so I want to make the point that we explicitly tried to center wellness and acknowledgement of trauma around this work of teaching and learning, and around this work of rethinking what we do as we teach. I packed a lot into that, but I just wanted to say all those things. Thanks for listening.
Well, Josh, and I want to pick up on what you and Mace had both shared with regard to other forms of assessment or other forms of measures factoring in overall. What I'm not hearing and haven't heard you say is let's do away with grades entirely. What I've heard you say is that, and read and know, is that there are other ways of knowing as well within the course, right? I think about, I guess on one level, I was disappointed to see grades so high, even though I'm all in favor of grades. Steph and I recently did but the grades right? And they must be inclusive of others, right? And Steph and I recently did a session on gateway courses. Actually, Steph did it. I followed along, or I tagged along, and made the point around active learning being an embedded component or an intentional component in courses, but that doesn't mean you do away with all lecture, or you have to do away with all lecture, right? And it's the same sort of thing here. I'm reminded on the student engagement note in your article of key takeaway from maybe 4 years ago from an essay or article in the Journal of American History titled Beyond Big Data, where those historians sort of pushed against the use of big data, although they acknowledged they wound up using it, but they actually were able to learn in the process of doing the research that creating a sense of belonging and creating purposes and relevance in their history courses were better predictors of who succeeds than disaggregated data. But in the absence of those components, disaggregated data were some of the best, right? So it really got them much more focused on how do we help students see the purpose and relevance in what we're doing, and how do we create and foster a sense of belonging in them. And I think that's one of the key takeaways in your work as well. Caring for faculty, and reminds me that we also need to care for our faculty and or colleagues who are in the audience right now. And we want to open it on up and ask them to ask some questions, because we're about 35 minutes in. And if I didn't stop here and ask for colleagues to ask questions, Katie would, but Katie will do it even better. So Katie, tell our colleagues how they should pose questions.
Sure, Drew. So we would ask that
Thank
you
you.
post them in the chat or use the Q&A box. We do have a couple questions if you want me to go ahead and ask the first one.
Go for it.
All right. So the first question says, can you say what prior knowledge is often lacking in STEM or in other areas? I think that's for the students.
I mean, if we're talking about STEM, it's more on the like math. We're talking about math, and if they had some biology courses in high school, but they were not interested for whatever reason. They did not perform well, and they come to college without the knowledge that educators expect them to have. But on some, I'm talking about STEM areas, but in non-STEM areas, like I said, it was not really prominent. So we can only talk about the STEM, and usually it's more math is mentioned a lot, because math is more like you can use it in biology and chemistry and better. So yeah, I'm not sure I answered the question.
Yeah, so in terms of like a core like disciplinary knowledge, I think Mehri's right that the math is the one that came up most. I do think there is some, if you think broadly beyond that, there are concerns about writing skills, and communication skills broadly is another one that comes up regularly that crosses multiple disciplines beyond STEM. But I actually wanted to go to something that Mace was talking about a little bit earlier, which is really around the kind of the ways in which the system is structured. And actually, to me, one of the most important prior knowledges that many students are coming into our systems struggling with is actually that kind of social capital, that academic capital of knowing how to navigate our systems. And so our curriculum are structured in particular ways that are very Western Eurocentric kind of ways of kind of structuring things. There's a lot of kind of implicit assumptions around how students need to navigate, how students need to engage in learning in these fields. And when learners are coming with these diverse kind of backgrounds and perspectives and these multiple ways of knowing and being and doing in the work that they do, I think they can sometimes struggle when they hit that system. And so I think, to me, that's actually when we talk about some of the equity challenges that the faculty and the TLA are grappling with. In many cases, it's that actual, they might be very knowledgeable learners, they might be really gifted in so many different ways, but they hit that system and struggle. And that's actually one of the things that I think is really important to acknowledge.
And if I might just quickly add to what Brad has said, I think too, one of the frustrations that we see in the Teaching and Learning Academy, while not explicit in this article, but it's sort of embedded in there, is the frustration that faculty feel in terms of, again, communication. Like they can see that there's a problem, that students maybe don't know how to navigate the system, but they feel a bit helpless. They can't do enough for these students, or they don't know what to do for these students. And I think that's one of the greatest challenges I see, especially when we think about, and this is going a bit beyond the bounds of the article, but thinking about student mental health. I think oftentimes faculty just don't even know what to do. And then there's also the capacity issue. Even if you do know what to do, how are you going to meet all of these students where they are and really help them along while tending for yourself? And that's one thing that, we've been reflecting on a bit and need to do more reflection on probably as we think to the future of this work, because it is so significant in the lives of our faculty and certainly in the lives of the students too.
Thanks for adding that, Steph. Can I just, related to what you just pointed out, I think one of the challenges that we do face, and this is something that's come up in the context of our TLA work broadly, again, it's not in the article, is that many of the interventions we're trying to support through this are actually course level transformations, so micro level interventions, when the reality is that the interventions for them to succeed, to truly tackle the equity challenges, often are at the program level or at the that meso level, or even at the macro level, at the institutional level. And so I think faculty struggle where they see what needs to happen, but within their sphere of influence, they actually can only change so much. So it's one of the things that we often talk about when we do our gallery walk is, and introduce the liberatory design model, is actually reflecting on who are the partners in your work that you need to involve in this, and then also what are the spheres of influence where you can actually make change, and so then trying to think about those as elements of this.
That seems like a good segue into the question that I see in the Q&A, perhaps.
Excellent.
I don't want to take your role, Katie.
Did you see me unmute? So the next question is, how do we engage the gatekeepers who set the learning outcomes for a STEM course or program, as these are typically the learning standards that faculty end up designing assessments around? Anybody want to tackle that one?
I mean, it's complex, and it's gonna require many approaches. I always say start with a conversation, and in that conversation, show the data. The data continues to tell the same story, that those gateway courses are they act as readouts, they act as bottlenecks, they act as gateways, they act as perpetuating, disparities in education and in STEM education. Without putting blame, I think having conversation, showing the data, and then what are the implications of the data beyond today and tomorrow for our society, for our humanity, for our democracy? And I think in addition to that, I think bring the students into the conversations. I think oftentimes we study the students, we do all kind of, analysis. What we ought to do is like really hear from them, have them look at what's going on. In addition, I think it's important to engage, obviously, those who teach gateway courses and empower them. And also look at the system. How does the system empower them or disempower them? If we have adjunct faculty who are teaching those gateway courses, are they empowered to make major changes, or are they just, handed a curriculum that they have to follow and they have to follow? So I would say, and then also this has to be institutional effort, a department effort. So right now, in a lot of the professional development activities that I've been part of or that I organize, people who already buy into this come to those events. What about the person who teaches those courses, never been to any of those events, never read an article about pedagogy, or how do we get them in when they have the protection of perhaps, they're a full professor, they're tenure, they're not really interested in coming to these? How do we expand our efforts so they are part of our work? So those are just my preliminary thoughts, and I'd love to hear what my colleagues have to say.
Okay, if I can add just two things, I think I'm so glad, Mace, you raised students up as partners in this work. I think that's critical. And I agree completely that centering data in this is actually really powerful. When I first started trying to do this transformation work at my previous institution, I used to work at Dalhousie University of the far east coast of Canada. Drew's article, Many Thousands Failed, was actually one of the ways into engaging in this conversation, putting data up front that, you know, wasn't Canadian data, it wasn't from my institution, but it still kind of really shone a light on some of the inequities that we saw, and that actually was a transformational moment as we started to really try to think about this work, where people said, well, what is our data? And then, well, as soon as you say, well, what is our data, then it opens up a door to actually having conversation. The two other things I wanted to add, though, were so in the Canadian context, a significant amount of the work we do around gateway courses is actually focused on our Indigenous students and working with in our Indigenous students who have really been challenged by the systems of higher education over the decades. So we actually have increasingly worked with our broader Indigenous communities as part of partners in this work as well. So I'd encourage you to think about, well, who are the communities actually beyond your institution that might actually be partners in this work? And that has actually enabled us to support some of the pathways into our institution in ways that actually are enabling student success in different ways. The other group that I think we have to increasingly target are academic leaders, our heads and chairs, our deans, our associate deans have to be part of the professional development that for folks at that level, it has to be a priority. And so I'm privileged to be in a role as an associate provost where I can actually instigate some of that work at my institution. But it is, you know, if we have program chairs, department chairs, associate deans who are actually perpetuating kind of the systems of old, you know, we have to actually be able to support and tackle the development of that group, because they are often enablers of faculty to make the kind of systemic changes that we're hoping for, but also they can be some of the biggest barriers to enabling that change too. So
Can I jump in, Brad, and push you on that a little bit? Because I think Bernadette's question, which was outstanding, and I'm glad we came back to it, the idea of kind of we at all levels of our institutions, whether we're teachers, whether administrators, whether we're in whatever it is our role, that how do we engage with these gatekeepers, these leaders, to say, you know, how do we enable that change or encourage that change or engage these leaders at our institutions such that they will want to join or want to participate or want to lead in those regards, so that way we can see those changes happen, ideally within our lifetimes, because we're really slow to change. So how do we get our leaders to do some of this work?
So the how for me is actually the three things that well, at least the way that we're tackling it in my institution, I'll just use that context, is actually the two things that May said and one addition I said. So centering data in this conversation with academic leaders, actually enabling students to actually be part of the conversation with academic leaders to actually understand lived perspectives, because sometimes you know, making sure that students are present as part of the work, and then also centering external communities as part of that work with our academic leaders. So those are the three things that I'm trying to work on, but I would love to hear what others are doing, including you, Josh, at your institution, because I know you're trying to tackle this at Embry-Riddle too. Or
even from the folks who are in our audience. I think there's got to be other folks who have ideas on what they're doing, how they're engaging in this work. I'd love to hear from them too.
Yeah, and I'd put this out there where, Josh, you asked the question, how do we engage the gatekeepers? I challenge ourselves to some extent too, to say, when and where are we the gatekeepers? You know, we're our own you know, perceptions, which may have been unknowingly set, limit possibilities, right? James wrote about this in an essay called On a Certain Form of Blindness in Human Beings. You know, but I mentioned this, and he clearly wasn't talking about ocular. He was talking about sort of cognitive. I mentioned this. It's both for us to attempt to engage the gatekeepers and also challenge ourselves in the process of doing that work. But you asked our colleagues who are participating how they're doing the work, right? So if folks want to put that in the chat, we'd love to learn from and with you.
Or in the Q&A.
Or in the Q&A.
Yeah, wherever. Or unmute and share.
Oh, that's heretical.
And I would suggest if you would like to unmute and share, just raise your hand, and Brittany will work with you to make that happen. We do have one more question that came into me that is similar but a little bit different, and it says that Dr. Foote mentioned the importance of how we communicate with students. So how are you determining the best ways to communicate with students, and how? And I think this is not just for Dr. Foote, but for all of you. And how are you using student input to impact how you communicate? How are you getting students involved in your communication with them?
I'd be happy to start us off, and then I know my colleagues will have lots of ideas. So one of the things that I do very actively now is to invite current students to help me in this communication challenge opportunity, as I like to see it. So one of the very tangible things that I've done is I know that students come into some of the courses that I teach, especially courses about theory, scared about theory because they've never studied it. And it seems very intimidating. And then they find out also that on top of the fact that they're very scared about the subject matter, that they have to be able to write using APA formatting. It's just, a given in my department. So one of the things that I've done for the last few semesters is to invite my current students to help me to develop a wisdom wall. This was not my idea. It came from Michelle Pacansky-Brock, who is a visionary in online teaching and learning and engagement of students in online teaching and learning. And I use this as a tool to communicate with students before classes begin, to let them know that it's okay if you're scared. Here's some advice from your peers. Here's some things that they were scared about themselves as they entered this course and as they entered the program. And I share that with them in a liquid syllabus, which is basically a living version of my syllabus, where I have resources on things like APA and things on the subject matter too that make it more accessible to students. I send that out to them before the class begins, and I also have a pre-course survey that I invite them to complete too. But it sets a tone for communication, and it's very helpful because students return back to the advice over and over again. So as we're talking, I refer to the advice from the peers in the wisdom wall, and they refer to it too. And it really helps to humanize the connections and the communication, even that we have in the beginning and throughout the entire semester. It really sets a tone. And I will add that you can use the wisdom wall idea in any course. It doesn't matter what the subject matter is, what the level or the modality. It's just a great resource tool approach.
So I have a closing question, but we also have 8 minutes left yet, so it may be too early for a closing question. So Katie, are there any other questions or comments from our nearly 60 participants?
I don't have any other questions now. I often find when we have no questions, it's because they're so enthralled in the responses. So they're not. So I would encourage our colleagues to ask any questions or comments.
Well, Annie Evans from New American History just popped something in there, just as you were.
As I said, there was not.
Yes, there wasn't, right? So hi, Annie. It's good to quote unquote see you and quote unquote hear from you.
All right, just a minute. It's a long one. For higher education instructors partnering with K-12 educators on pedagogy strategies in exchange for your expertise and access to content often behind a university library access code or paywall, is a wonderful exchange that builds bridges for K through 16. Also expanding the use of rich digital humanities projects into higher education and allowing students to create these in lieu of a formal paper can strengthen their critical thinking and engagement within the content of Gateway courses. Many come to you with high school experience using GIS, story maps, etc. Does anybody want to respond to that?
Well, just that I love the idea of actually getting students to work on these kind of rich projects. I think Annie talked about kind of rich digital humanities projects. But I actually think this goes well beyond the humanities and into other fields as well. I'm a historian originally, so I'm kind of very partial to the digital humanities projects that Annie talks about. But I actually have worked with people to have students working on creating projects that cross multiple different disciplines. So I love that. I love that approach.
And I'll add or pick up on what Brad shared there. This is sort of an inverse of a question earlier that I asked Mehri, which was around, in this case, it's the application of the humanities to the STEM fields or to other fields, not just the STEM fields. When you look at the digital humanities and the types of tools that our colleagues at New American History, but they're not the only ones, but they are represented by Annie right now, put out there on the forced migration of enslaved persons or the elements around the contemporary impact of New Deal era redlining. There's not just history, there's present day implications, and the present day implications have manifestations in business, finance, science, technology, engineering, math, what have you, right? So when we talk about engaging in purpose and relevance, which we discussed earlier, and belonging, these are definitely ways in which, or tools, useful tools in making that happen. So Annie, thanks for pointing that out. And I realize I didn't co-author the article. Sorry, I chimed in on the session. Yeah. So here's the closing question with 3.5 minutes remaining, but who's counting? What's next? How are you going to use this going forward, or what are you going to do with it going forward? I'm talking to you, Brad.
Well, I think I'm the only one that doesn't have my mute on. I should have remuted. I didn't.
Yeah.
So I think there's actually a couple key points to what's next, and I'm going to call out one of them, knowing that I would like Mehri and Stephanie to talk a little bit further about that, which is actually following up with faculty members to see how so they come out of our Teaching Learning Academy with some commitments that they've committed to change processes. And we'd really like to follow up with them to see how those change processes have unfolded and what has been successful, what has not, what are some of the challenges to that. Mehri and Stephanie are kind of working on mapping out that project, so I'll let them speak to that one. But for me, actually, one of the things that I would really love, as we've continued to dive into the liberatory design framework, I think we're really interested in kind of really pushing that model further to really think about, well, how does this kind of best kind of support the work that we're doing within the higher education context. And so the design frame of that model and the kind of the mindsets that the model encourages people to adapt as they move forward are things that we're really trying to continue to push and evolve. And so I think that a major part of our work is going to be hopefully working towards further exploration of that particular model. But there's so many different rabbit holes we could collectively go down that but I would love to turn it over to Steph and Mehri if you wouldn't mind talking about the other one.
Mehri, do you want to start, or would you like me to start?
You can go, and
okay. So what Brad said about the model and the mindsets is absolutely where we're going immediately. But we're also on a journey to learn more, as he described. And Mehri we've been working together to come up with a follow-up study. So we want to know both immediately and on a longer term basis, how faculty members are using the information that they've learned, and what challenges do they experience in terms of dealing with their own equity challenges, what that looks like, how they navigate those. And obviously that's important to us because we can use that information to further enhance what we're doing in the Teaching and Learning Academy, but also just broadly with faculty development. We know that it's important to better understand, what's happening even on a more individual level, because we just don't know. We can assume based on what we've been told, but the follow-up interviews are, I'm sure, going to be very illuminating. And we've already done some follow-up interviewing, and we'll be doing some more for the additional study. And we're doing a study involving biology educators too. So we're excited about that. So looking broadly and also looking at a more specialized discipline too.
Well, Steph, Mehri,
Mace, I was going to say, if we have time, it would be wonderful for Mace to talk about the work that's being done around agreements as well, because I think that's another rabbit hole that would be really worth exploring. But sorry, I know we might not have time. Sorry.
Right. We don't
bring
have
that
time.
up right at the hour.
Yeah. So I put in the chat an article that was published actually in the same edition, in the same with this article about agreements in STEM education. And currently we have a study going on that is we're interviewing students and STEM faculty, which of those agreements show up to them most and impact their education, impact their teaching. And so stay tuned. And I'll just put the article again in the chat. Thank you, Brad.
Well, Steph, Mehri, Mace, Brad, Josh, we're looking forward to having you back on this series when that next article comes out, as well as anything else you may do, right? It's great to have such talent on the expanded Gardner Institute team or extended Gardner Institute team. So pleased to have you all involved in this right now. Katie's gonna tell us what we need to know before we all sign off, right? So Katie.
So we will, first I want to let you know later this week, you'll receive an email with us, which has a link to today's conversation, as well as a list of the resources mentioned in today's conversation. So thank you, everyone. And I see a couple of our colleagues in the audience have shared those some links, so we appreciate that. And then we'll tell you that our last one of this semester is happening on December 3rd, and that will be with Peter Felton and Leo Lambert, and they will talk about their book, Relationship Rich Education. So we thank first our guests today. It was informative and always interesting to hear from you all. And thank you everybody in the audience who spent their time with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
And thanks, Katie and Drew, for hosting us and inviting us.
Yeah, it was really valuable.